Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rabbi Julie Roth. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Jewish Life on campus, which is the Hillel at Princeton University. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's conversation with critically acclaimed journalist Ari Shavit, who was described earlier on the walk over here by a student as actually quite normal. The author of the New York Times bestseller, My Promised Land, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. As many of you know, Tom Friedman has called My Promised Land a must-read. I just wanted to briefly explain why, for me, as an American Jew, as a campus rabbi, as a member of the Princeton University community, My Promised Land is a must-read. This book has opened up the minds and the hearts of tens of thousands of readers, helping us to see the decisions and the choices that went into the establishment of the State of Israel. I know for myself, though I knew that Israeli Independence Day was also called Nakba, or the catastrophe, by Palestinians, I didn't really understand why. And it's not just that I didn't really understand why. I didn't really have a way to understand or an easy access point or a willingness to understand why until I read this book, which not only introduced me intellectually but emotionally to the narrative of the Palestinians, the refugees fleeing Lida, which broke my heart, but it also opened my heart. This book, importantly, talks not only about the tragedies, but the triumphs. For me, reading this book was like an emotional roller coaster. Every time you finished one chapter, you knew as you turned to the next chapter that it would have a different emotional valence. At a time when we have just gone through a very traumatic year in terms of events in Israel and in terms of campus conversations here and elsewhere about Israel, where the discussions seem to be very polarized, it's very powerful to have Ari Shavit here as a model of somebody who can talk in a gamze vegamze kind of way. You know, gamze vegamze is a Hebrew expression that means this and also this. And I think that this book really embraces not only the existential fear, but also the stories of the occupation. It allows us to remember that in the establishment of the State of Israel, we made the desert bloom, and we also created Palestinian refugees. Ari Shavit is here to remind us that whether or not we agree with his analysis, these stories, the stories of triumph and the stories of tragedy, deserve to be reckoned with and wrestled with. I think it's important for everyone to know that earlier today, Ari Shavit was meeting with students and with faculty, and that he's here at Princeton as part of a tour that will take him to a total of 28 college campuses around the United States. And these campus talks are sponsored both by the local Hillel and Hillel International. And the purpose of these lectures and these small conversations is really to bridge the divide between narratives, between generations, and between viewpoints. Earlier today, when Ari was talking to students, he told them that he believes that hope emerges through the combination of morality and realism, and that hope is what emerges on the other side of complexity. I know someone else who shares that philosophy. He happens to be sitting right next to Ari Shavit. We're joined also today by Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, who I had the privilege of traveling to Israel with on a CGL-sponsored trip last December with 25 students. It was a trip where we met with Palestinian and Israeli leaders, and through these face-to-face meetings really heard about the complexities and the multiple narratives exemplified in My Promised Land. It's such an honor that we have Daniel Kurtzer here at Princeton in the position of the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School. Following his 29-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, Kurtzer retired in 2005 with the rank of career minister. From 2001 to 2005, he served as the United States ambassador to Israel, and from 1997 to 2001 as the United States ambassador to Egypt. Ambassador Kurtzer is the author of 3 important books on the peace process and is here to moderate the program and to introduce Ari Shavit. I now turn the program over to Ambassador Dan Kurtzer.
Good afternoon. The importance of today's speaker is indicated by the fact that he gets two introductions. Because I also want to share with you an excerpt from a review of his book that was written by Leon Wieseltier in the New York Times. And I think it says a great deal about, as Julie suggested, the complexities and contrasts that Ari Shavit covers so well. So bear with me, and I will take only a few moments of your time. Wieseltier writes, Israel is too often judged for its viability or its validity, as if some fundamental acceptance of its reality is pending upon the resolution of its many problems with itself and with others. About the severity of those problems, there is no question, and some of them broach primary issues of politics and morality, but Israel's problems are too often combined and promoted into a quote-unquote problem, which has the effect of emptying the Jewish state of its actuality and consigning it to a historical provisionality, a permanent condition of controversy from which it can be released only by furnishing various justifications and explanations. It is one of the achievements of Ari Shavit's important and powerful book to recover the feeling of Israel's facticity and to revel in it, to restore the grandeur of the simple fact in full view of the complicated facts. My Promised Land, the book, startles in many ways, not least in its relative lack of interest in providing its readers with handy politics. Shavit has an undoctrinaire mind. He comes not to praise or to blame, though along the way he does both with erudition and with eloquence. He comes instead to observe and to reflect. Shavit makes his choice. He does not reject Zionism, though he does not make excuses either. He condemns the perpetrators of crimes, but he does not condemn the war for survival and self-determination in which the crimes were committed. We're going to hear a great deal this afternoon from one of Israel's foremost commentators. He is a columnist and a member of the editorial board of Haaretz, Israel's newspaper of record, frequent contributor to publications around the world. And he is one of the most thoughtful people about the reality, the facticity of Israel. And he comes at a perfect time. Israeli elections, the resort of the Palestinians to the International Criminal Court, the stalemate in the peace process, problems on Israel's borders. There is no one better to try to explain all of this to us than Ari Shavit.
So I'm truly humbled to stand here. Having been grown up in an academic environment, Princeton was always a place that was very significant for me. I was here only once or twice, and this place that had the combination of one great academic who went on to become a great president, and then one other academic who almost became Israel's second president, has a special meaning for me. It's an tense evening today in Israel. We don't know, once again, what the future holds. Something has happened 2 days ago which created renewed tension when no one expected it. And it was not easy to leave Israel just a day ago and to come here, leaving behind my family and my profession during a time of the combination of internal drama and what, God forbid, might become an external drama. But because I believe so much in the importance of having this new kind of conversation and discussion regarding Israel by the people who love it and by the people who are critical of it, I felt at peace coming here, even at this time, and I'm really feel privileged to be talking to you tonight. I was asked to talk about the triumph and the tragedy. The reason I wrote my book was this deep sense that Israel is torn between the triumph dimension of it and the tragedy that is always and constantly there. And the reason I wrote the book was that I felt that one of the main problems we have in Israel, and one of the main problems we have with people talking about Israel, is the fact that we have lost the Israel narrative. Any nation needs a narrative. Definitely, somewhat artificial immigrant nations need a narrative. And Israel definitely needs a narrative. Because we are a unique, for better and for worse, we are a unique nation that combines strength and fragility. And in many ways, we are the result of a narrative. We had a narrative before we had anything else. We had a strong sense of who we are and what we must accomplish and why we must accomplish it before we had anything else in that country. Before we had a state, before we had an army, before we had an economy, we had a strong sense of who we are and what our story is. Sadly, over the last decades, 30 or 40 years, the narrative has disintegrated. First of all, it happened because of the Six-Day War, or to be precise, because of the seventh day following the Six-Day War. The great debate over the territories, peace, occupation, settlements, whatever you want to call it, cracked the sense that we had before of being the just and the besieged. But then later on, another problem emerged. Many Israelis, following the 73 war, have become cynical regarding our own nation. If before 73 we were too self-confident, arrogant, sure of ourselves, since 73 we became in many ways too critical, too judgmental. So while there is a lot to criticize, we lost in many ways the ability to see the wonder Israel is. So what I tried to do in my book is to bring back that sense of wonder. But what I wanted to do as well is to go beyond the usual polemics, to go beyond the attitudes of Israel can do no wrong and Israel can do no right, to look at the complexity that is the essence of our existence. As I told some students earlier today, I did not have any political ambitions regarding the book. I do my political battles in my op-eds in Haaretz and on Israeli television and elsewhere. But I wanted people to have a sense of how complex Israel is and how complex the Middle East is, so that anyone who has a vision of it will realize that any simple or simplistic idea about the nation or about the region is wrong. And it's our duty, our moral, intellectual duty, to wrestle with the complexity of the Israeli condition, not looking just at one side of it or another. I was determined to write a book that is a human book, that brings back the human dimension. And in this sense, I think it's so important to go back to the beginning, which is what I did in the book, but what I urge all people who care about Israel to realize and remember. The reason that Israel is so impressive, the reason that the Israeli achievement is so wondrous, is that the early Zionists, I write in my book about my own great-grandfather, but he was just one of many. The early Zionists had brilliant insight regarding the fate of the Jews in the 20th century and beyond. again, when I looked at my own family, at my own background, the question I asked myself is, why did my great-grandfather leave behind London, in which he lived a great, prosperous life, a London that was the capital of the world, and why did he leave all that behind to travel to the remote, desolate province Palestine was in 1897? Chaim Weizmann used to say that you don't have to be crazy to be a Zionist, but it helps. And my great-grandfather's journey from London to the port of Jaffa seemed to be crazy. But it was not. It was not. Because what the early Zionists saw is that the Jewish people would face in the 20th century two great dramatic challenges. On the one hand, they saw that Europe was becoming a death trap to its Jews. They did not know there will be a Holocaust. They did not know that there will be Auschwitz and Treblinka. But they realized that Europe is becoming a death trap to its Jews, and there is no hope, definitely for the Jews of Eastern Europe. So faced with the most radical challenge a people can be faced with, the challenge of extinction, they came up with the most radical solution that people can come up with. And in order to save our people, they transferred it from one continent to another and took a land and built a nation and revived a language. When people say today, in some academic circles, that Zionism is colonialism, that Israel is a product of imperialism, that's one thing that really makes me outrageous. I have real moral rage. Because we were Europe's ultimate other for 1,500 years. And then we were about to become Europe's ultimate victim. And the brilliant idea the early Zionists had was to use European power in order to create a European-like safe haven outside of Europe to save us from the rage of Europe. This is as far from colonialism as one can imagine. We used the relationship with the empires in order to do it. But we were not the masters of the universe. We were not the real power. We were victims who were saving themselves at the very last moments, acting with imagination and creativity in a sophisticated way to save our lives. And in this sense, our revolution is one of the most impressive of the 20th century revolutions, because it did not only give a people political rights, economical rights, but it gave us a life. And the real sin of Zionism was that it was too late. Because if Herzl had begun his endeavor 20 years earlier, if he would have had the movement begin in the 1870s rather than the 1890s, if he would have had a Jewish state in 1920s rather than in 1948, millions and millions would have been saved. But the early Zionists had another insight, not as tragic, but quite a serious and dramatic one. Because they also realized that once the pogroms will subside and brutal, violent anti-Semitism will be gone, modern, non-ultra-Orthodox Jews will be faced with a totally different challenge. Because as I say in my book, the old Jewish formula of living in the diaspora was based on the two great Gs, on the defense of the walls of the ghetto and the intimate relationship with God. But when these two changed in the modern era, non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish civilization became challenged, at the very least. And in order to maintain non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish life in the 20th century, in the 21st century, in the 22nd century and beyond, there is a need There is an essential need to have a place that is a powerhouse for relevant modern Jewish identity. The early Zionists thought all Jews should go to Palestine. I totally disagree. I think that in order to have vital, prosperous Jewish life throughout the world, in Jewish communities in North America and elsewhere, we need an Israel. But we need an Israel that is a liberal Israel, a democratic Israel, a benign Israel. And this is, in brackets, where I'm so angry at recent Israeli governments and present-day Israeli politics, because we are not fulfilling now the mission that we must fulfill, which is to be a beacon for young Jews in the diaspora, to be a place that helps strengthen Jewish identity while being a proof and being a powerhouse for this kind of liberal, democratic Jewish identity. But if these were the two insights that made Israel essential, that justify Israel and make Israel so needed, there was another side to the story. And another side to the story was our inability to see our own other. Because when my great-grandfather arrived in the port of Jaffa, he would not see that Jaffa is a predominantly Arab city. And when he traveled throughout the country in his Thomas Cook carriages, he would not see the dozens of Palestinian villages on the way from Jaffa to Jerusalem and from Jerusalem to the Lake Sea, led to the Sea of Galilee. And so did his peers. There was a need, there was an inherent need to be blind to the existence of the other. Now, I put it in perspective. There was no Palestinian republic we conquered. There was no Palestinian kingdom. Even the Palestinian people defined themselves as a people decades later. But there were other people there, and because of our desperate need to have the land, we would not see that they are there. So right there at the beginning, you have the seeds of both the triumph and the tragedy. The tragedy is this amazing, amazing phenomenon of a small, almost desperate people to save itself in the last moment in the most sophisticated way possible. And the tragedy is the tragedy of the conflict. Because the conflict did not begin when Benjamin Netanyahu walked into his office. It did not even begin in 1967. It was right there from the very beginning, the moment that the first Zionists stepped into the land, not seeing the Palestinians, while the Palestinians would not see us. When I look at our early history, I first of all see the triumph. First of all, it was this amazing, amazing diagnosis. The ability to see so far ahead, to see what we are faced with, was quite astounding. But that was not enough. Beyond that came the most impressive leadership, statesmanship one can think of. Think of it. A people with no political tradition, a people that had no sovereignty. In our first generation of two, of stepping onto the world stage, we had Herzl, we had Weizmann, we had Ben-Gurion, and we had all the people and the culture, the political culture that surrounded them. Astounding, astounding political genius based on what was said before, a combination of realism and morality. not being naive. This was no flower children movement. We knew the world is a tough place. We knew that we'll have to be tough in this world. But we also knew that we are Jews, and therefore we must be moral. We must have justice and morality as part of our political DNA. And the way the early Zionists, these great leaders, combined the two is quite astounding. We can get into details later. But then came the third element. The third element was realizing that we are talking about a unique national project. Unique does not mean that we are better than others or worse than others. We are people like any other people. But the circumstances of our existence are different. No other people did what we did. To go back to build a national home in our ancient homeland after 2,000 years. And to build that national home under the volcano. So realizing this is a unique project, they came up with the most unique inventions. The kibbutz, the moshav, the istadrut, the kupat cholim. Today we talk about Israeli technological innovation, but the political and social innovation of early Zionism was mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. We knew that we cannot do what others did. We learned from everyone. These people were very worldly. They knew what's happening everywhere in the world. But they realized that because we are faced with a unique condition, we have to bring out unique solutions. The fourth element of this great triumph was the spirit of life-loving people. The remarkable combination of being revolutionary on the one hand, with all the sacrifice, the terrible human sacrifice that went with it, but having a taste and a lust for life, for normalcy. So at the same time, you have the kibbutzim being created and all this struggle for the valley of Harod that I described and others. But at this very same time, Tel Aviv is emerging as a capital of normalcy and life and civilization and arts. The Tel Aviv Party did not begin in 2000. The Tel Aviv Party was there in 1935. So you had with this movement these two elements all the time without which we wouldn't have won. Because on the one hand, you needed this zeal, this commitment, this understanding that this is an enormous human endeavor. But on the other hand, we always had a sense of humor. And we always loved to party and to live. And this kept us away from the traps that the Soviet Revolution, for instance, went into. We were always had a kind of twinkle in the eye. It wasn't all like serious and harsh. So this the combination of the diagnosis, the amazing statesmanship, this realization of the uniqueness of the condition, and this spirit, these are what made Israel so triumphant. But on the other side, the tragedy kept biting. Until 1936, we ignored it. We wanted to believe the conflict is not inevitable. But then we realized it is there. And we turned tough. And we hardened our hearts. And then the tragedy came to its peak, to its climax, in 1948. So many questions were asked regarding my leader chapter. But this is the climax of the tragedy. This is where what was set out in motion 50 years earlier, this is when it all happened. Everything led to leader, and in many ways, everything we experience to this day is a result of that. because the conflict was such a unique conflict. And it's not by chance that so many people of goodwill have tried to end this conflict, and so many people of goodwill have failed. Because there is something especially stubborn. There's the multi-layered tragedy of it that is so difficult to wrestle with. And yet, in my mind, when I ask myself, what have I learned while I wrote this book? I think the most important thing I've learned is how wondrous young Israel was. Israel of the 1950s and 1960s. Imagine America, God forbid, going through a war in which it loses 3.5 million people. God forbid. And then imagine America in the following 3.5 years absorbing 500 million immigrants. Can it be done? Is it humanly possible? Israel of the 1950s did that. Many people talk about the pioneers and the warriors, but other nations had pioneers and warriors. The civilian courage and wisdom of Israel of the 1950s is unparalleled. No other people did that. But it's not only the numbers. Who are the people who came there in the 1950s? So many of them were refugees from the Arab world who lost everything overnight. And so many of them were Holocaust survivors. People who lost their old families and had to start afresh. People who had nightmares at night. Numbers tattooed into their arms. But these people did not become addicted to victimhood. Their revenge was not suicide bombing. Their revenge was to live and to build a life, to send their kids to the best schools, to create the best possible health system. So in my mind, you do not have to be Jewish or Israeli in order to see that Israel of the 1950s is the most amazing triumph of the human spirit. We literally came from hell, but we did not surrender to hell, and we created a life for ourselves. Sadly, that wisdom, the political, economic, social wisdom of the 50s that had prices to it, was lost later on. And Israel of the 70s, 80s, 90s, to this day, has lost the ethos that held it together, lost the kind of inspiring leadership it had. Our political body is in many ways dysfunctional to this day. And this is why we could not deal in time with the problem of occupation. This is why we did not deal properly with our internal challenges. So when I look at Israel of today, what do I see? On the one hand, I see an intimidated nation. I'm an anti-occupation person, I always was. I always thought settlements are a horrible idea. But one has also to remember intimidation. Because Israel is not only unique today in the fact that it is occupying another people, it's also unique in the sense that its existence is in jeopardy, like no other democracy is jeopardized. So what you see there is the tension between Israel and large parts of the Islamic world, not all, thank God, tensions with large parts of the Arab world, not all of it, thank God, and this terrible clash with the Palestinians that doesn't end. And because of these three tensions, No Israeli knows what the future holds. America has many problems, but no one in this hall has any doubt whether America will be here in 20 years' time. No Israeli can be certain if Israel will be there in 20 years' time or 50 years' time. We don't talk about it. It's a taboo. But this defines the special human and psychological Israeli condition. But if this is the manifestation of the tragedy, the triumph is in the fact that while we live on the edge, we live with such intensity. While we are endangered, we party. Israel is so vital, so vibrant, and you see it in every realm of life. So everybody knows about the Israeli high-tech boom, which is so amazing. But it's only one of the manifestations of this unique Israeli vitality. We are innovative, and we are creative, and we are sensual, and we are sexy. We make more babies than any other OECD country. And this intensity of life that you see in the theater, in poetry, in cinema, in dance, in commerce, in technology, in science, in the human relations that people have, this is like a great source of hope and comfort. Because while Zionism failed in establishing the utopia it wanted to establish, there is no socialist paradise there. The kibbutz dream is shattered. But the real achievement is establishing this robust free society that is so energetic, too energetic, wild, but is so impressive in this sense that if you look at our history and you look at our present and you wonder about our future, you are astonished by this spirit that Israelis have. When I look at the challenges of the day, what do I see? When you look about the tension between Israel and large parts of the Islamic world, the main source for concern is Iran. Iran is very much on our minds tonight because we don't know what will happen because of this weird event 2 days ago. But Iran, if Iran would go nuclear, it will not only intimidate Israel, but it will transform the Middle East. If Iran will go nuclear, the danger is that many other countries in the Middle East will go nuclear. And Israel might have to change its very responsible nuclear policy. So the need to stop Iran from going nuclear, and I'm not talking about military options, but I'm talking about assertive, creative, sophisticated diplomacy. The need to do this is essential. The other challenge facing us, external challenge, is the Arab chaos. What we are witnessing in the Middle East is really so dramatic that one finds difficulty to find the words. The old order that was based on the Sykes-Picot Agreement is melting away. So in some ways it's convenient for Israelis because some of the old threats are gone. There is no Syrian army that will invade us. There's no Iraqi army that will be sent to conquer Jerusalem. But seeing that the region we live in fails to be what other regions in the world are. When you look around us, and you see that right now, after all the hopes we had 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago, only in Tunisia there is some hope, but there is so much chaos and extremism and tribalism throughout the region. You wonder, how do we deal with this? How do we live with this deeply unstable environment. The third challenge is the Palestinian issue. I believe there is no other solution but the two-state solution. The current situation endangers Israel demographically, politically, and morally. Occupation is the silent killer that is endangering us and in many ways killing us while we ignore it. But we have to acknowledge the fact that all the previous attempts, Ambassador Kurtzer was a hero of these attempts, to solve this conflict and to deal with occupation in the old way, all of them have failed. 1993, we tried Oslo, and for whatever reason, never mind who is responsible, it ended up with terror and bloodshed. 2000, we tried Camp David Peace Summit, and it ended up with suicide bombing in the Second Intifada. 1,000 Israelis and 3,000 Palestinians dead. 2005, we tried something else, unilateralism in Gaza. It ended up with rockets landing in Tel Aviv. 2008, went back to try final status, didn't work. 2014, Secretary Kerry tries his ambitious peace initiative, doesn't work. So we are caught in a bind. On the one hand, we must do something about it. We must try to end occupation. We must move towards a two-state solution. But on the other hand, all the previous attempts to do it have failed. And it's time to learn from these failures. The fourth challenge, external challenge facing Israel, and I'm not talking about now the internal challenges, is in my mind as important as the others. The old Zionist success was based on two principles: having a deep relationship with a major power. First it was the British, then the French, and then this great alliance with America in the last 40 years. And the other was always capturing the moral high ground. As I said, we were not naive. When it came to war, Ben-Gurion was as tough as nails. But we always knew that we must try peace, and we always knew we must capture the moral high ground. Sadly, in the last decades, we've lost that wisdom. We've lost that wisdom. At the same time, I think there is a lot of lack of understanding in the West, especially in liberal circles, to realize the unique Israeli challenge and the unique dangers facing Israel. So the combination of our failure and the lack of understanding in larger parts of the West creates a dangerous situation that has to be dealt with. So, describing all this, do I think we are closer to the triumph, or is the tragedy around the corner? I think that a lot can be done. A lot can be done. I think the situation is a challenging situation, but I'm not hopeless at all. On the contrary. Basically, I'm an optimist. I believe in our people. I believe in democracies. I believe in the great American democracy, sometimes more than my American friends. And I believe in Israel's vitality and wisdom. But in order to deal with all this, we need fresh ideas, we need new vision. So in order to deal, we'll not go over all the challenges, but in order to deal with Iran, we need to take advantage of this great gift that we got, the collapse of the oil prices. That gives us all a great opportunity to try to stop Iran without using force, but while being realistic and creative. Because Iran has nearly achieved a technological victory, but it's facing it's near an economical defeat because it's so in trouble. So if the West takes this opportunity and deals with this challenge in a smart way in the coming year, I think there is a chance there. Regarding the Arab chaos and the Palestinian issue, I think the need is for a new kind of peace concept. Basically, my belief is that the bad news that comes out of this chaos is that no moderate Arab leader has enough legitimacy to sign a new peace agreement with Israel. But the good news is that so many moderate Arabs are closer to Israel than they ever were. They are afraid of Iran, afraid of Islamic extremism, the Islamic Brotherhood, of ISIS. They don't like Israel, but they realize Israel is a relatively reliable neighbor and they are willing to do business. At the same time, I think that there are constructive forces in Palestinian society that we can work with, and I definitely believe there is a silent, moderate majority in Israel that we can address. So if we bring about a new and more realistic peace concept that does not talk about a formal peace but a de facto peace, not an immediate peace but a gradual peace, rather than a futile peace process, have peace as a process, working with the moderate Palestinians and working with the moderate Arabs. I think that if America will lead such an initiative, it will serve peace, it will help us to gradually deal with occupation and settlements, and it will also give America the leading role it must have in the Middle East, not having hands-on leadership, but not ignoring the Middle East. We can build a new structure that promotes stability in this unstable region while bringing us closer to the end of occupation. If we cannot have a two-state solution tomorrow morning, let's launch two-state dynamics that create a two-state state that will eventually become a two-state solution. And regarding the relationship between Israel and the West, we really need to redefine ourselves. We have to go back to our source, to our roots. We were always associated with the progressive forces in the world, not with the reactionary forces. Labor Zionism did it with its relationship with the socialist movements, but even the Jabotinsky movement always insisted that the liberal dimension must be there, that we won't be just nationalists. We always realized that we are not a major power. As I like to say in today's term, we are not China, we cannot do Tibet. We are not Russia, we cannot do the Ukraine. If we go back to this new definition of Israel as the hub, as the powerhouse of liberal Zionism, if we make Israel noble again and benign again, so it is an inspiration to young Jews and young non-Jews throughout the world, rather than to have Israel as a source of embarrassment, we must make Israel a source of pride. Can this be done? It's very difficult, but it's not impossible. I do not know what will be the results of the Israeli elections, but what we've seen already in the last few weeks shows that there is more hope in Israel than people thought. Israel is not as extremist and some people think. Israel is not as conservative as the political system shows. But in order to create the change, to bring back this benign Israel, we must have these new ideas, this new vision. So we can talk to reasonable Israelis, asking them, demanding of them to change the way Israel is, while standing by them and while telling them that the world will stand by them when they do the right thing. The way to deal with Israel is not to boycott it, not to hate it, not to bash it all day long. The way to deal with it is to demand of Israel to become the just state it must be, but to guarantee it friendship and love and alliance when he does the right thing. When I wrote my book, I asked myself 3 questions. Why Israel? What's Israel? And will Israel? Why Israel? Because there is a need. There is an imperative moral need to have a home for the homeless people. And what's Israel? It's vitality against all odds. And will Israel? That depends on Israelis bringing back to their politics and their government the talent and energy and vitality that we see in Israeli society and in Israeli life. And that depends on the world, the international community, the people committed to peace, bringing about the new ideas, a new vision that will convince Israelis that it's safe to take the dangerous but needed operation that we must do in order to save ourselves. We have to go through a major heart surgery, open heart surgery. If we will not do it, we are endangering our very existence. But if the surgery is handled in an uncontrolled and professional way, we can also bleed to death on the operation table. So we are all committed, anyone caring about Israel and about the Palestinians, to handle this in a new, courageous, and responsible way. I'm sure that if we'll have the vision, if we'll have the ideas, if we'll have the determination and creativity, we'll be able to guarantee the future of Israel that is democratic, liberal, and eventually living in peace. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions for Mr. Shavit. What I would ask is that you line up behind the 2 microphones, and as is our usual way of business, we would give precedence to students, many of whom are cutting their final exams to be here. So, okay. Now, while you are lining up, I will take advantage of my presence as the moderator to ask the first question. And that is, Ari, as you moved from diagnosis to prescription, you left out, or potentially left out, one critical element, and that is human agency. There's a lot that needs to be done, but what can Israel do, initiate? What can Israeli leaders do, and are those leaders available to take the steps that you suggested at the end that would lead us towards this revitalized vision of the state? So line up. Ari will think about the question, and then we'll get to your questions.
So I answer yours first?
Yeah, sure.
So I have to understand better your question. So are there the people who will do it, or what should they do?
Both.
So again, let me begin with what I see as some hopeful news. I think that you see, without getting into specific names and party names, I think we see some hopeful movement in the last few weeks. If we talk about the last few months, we might talk later about what happened in the summer, the Gaza war. But not only the Gaza war was so horrible, but what we saw in Israel in the following months was so troubling. And I was, like my articles in Haaretz became more and more angry throughout the fall, because you saw that Israeli extremism was running out of control. Rather than to come back from the Gaza war and say, we did what we did, we were caught into it, but now we've learned the lesson, and we must bring about this new concept and do something that brings hope again. We went, our members of Knesset and some members of government went into these extreme right-wing ideas that were totally inconsistent with what the Likud was, not talking about what Labor or Meretz were. The democratic and liberal element in the Likud is only represented now with President Rivlin, thank God. But you saw the coalition parties really going to the wild right-wing edge, and it was terrifying. What is the good news? That if the Gaza war pushed Israelis to the right because they were traumatized, these extreme right-wingers overplayed their hands. They overplayed their hand. So now you see a kind of backlash, not only against the left, so to speak, which you saw during the war and after the war, but you see people who do not want to have this kind of Israel. So even if they are not totally pure liberals, they find this phenomenon of these semi-xenophobic ideas and semi-racist ideas and extremist ideas, they find it unappealing. At the end of the day, Israelis do not want some sort of biblical messianic republic. They want Israel to be as American as possible. And they want their version of the American dream. Again, they are not, this is where the lust for life is such an important force. So what you see in the last weeks is, again, we don't know what the results of the election will be, and there will be no glorious result. It's not that we will have an amazing government after the election. But you see that Israel, if in the past people thought that Israel was becoming Feiglin, the extreme, he was not even a Likudnik, today we realize that Israel is not Feiglin. Israel is not Feiglin. It's not that was like a result of the distortion of Israeli politics. So I see that there is some hope there, but I do believe that I do not see yet the intellectual work, I don't see enough creativity, and I don't see enough courage yet. So if we have a government that this way or the other is somewhat better than the previous government, that will be the real moment of truth. Because we'll need the new ideas and we'll need the courage and conviction to deal with the issue that we were discussing. The previous elections in Israel were totally crazy. Not only because of the right wing, because the center was totally escapist. It ignored, except for Tzipi Livni, people ignored the issue. They ignored the Palestinian issue, they ignored occupation, and they ignored the Arab world. I sometimes said that, I had a feeling in Israel, Israel became a victim of its own success. The Iron Dome syndrome. Because our Air Force is so strong, and the Shin Bet does its work, and the wall separates us from the Palestinians, we began living in a bubble. I once wrote that there was a feeling that if we disconnected ourselves from the Middle East, there was some explosions along the Jordan Valley, and Israel is now drifting in the Mediterranean. We just passed southern Italy, we're on our way to Spain. We thought we were becoming Ibiza. So, and this is with the reasonable Israelis. I'm not talking about the extremist Israelis. The reasonable Israelis have, because the old ideologies collapsed, the right-wing thing didn't work, occupation didn't work, peace didn't work, and unilateralism didn't work. So they decided, let's forget all about it. And they ignored. This is why we had crazy elections in 2013 and a crazy government since. Now it's different. Now it's not enough different. People are still, it's not good enough, but it's better than it was. So I really pray that it probably won't be on March 18th, but say by May 1st we'll have a new government that will be the moment. We'll have to come up with ideas, and we'll have to work in with this new kind of paradigm. I think there are many Israelis, including many of the new leaders, that are now receptive to it, and I think there is a glimmer of hope.
Let's take 2 questions here, and please, let's make them questions. Okay.
So you said we need new ideas, and a little phrase I caught that worried me, but I want to hear where you're heading with it, is the idea of a two-state state.
So what troubled you?
What troubled me is it could be Naftali Bennett could say the same words.
I think the combination of two-state doesn't come out of his lips.
But you understand what one could be.
No, I don't understand. No, I'll tell you something very harsh about that. I said it earlier today. I do not understand. This is not the first campus I've been to, and I've been on some serious discussions with people who are totally, anti-Israelis, definitely anti-Zionists, who promote the one-state idea. And I said, I wonder how it is that I have to wrestle with them in American universities. And then I come back and I find that my own right-wing minister is promoting a one-state idea, claiming that he's a Zionist. I mean, I just don't understand how anyone... I see all the difficulties of how do we get to the two-state solution. But how can anyone who is reasonable think that a one-state reality or a one-state solution can work? I just don't understand. And if people didn't get it in the past, I say, I have like a one-word answer for it. One-state solution, that's Syria. Syria is a one-state solution. You put Sunnis and Alawites and Druze in one country. As long as there was a strong dictator, it was no Denmark, but it somehow worked. The moment the dictator became weaker, they're slaughtering each other. That's what you want to do with Israelis, Palestinians, with all our history and all our problems? You want to live together in a kind of... this is such a fantasy. This is so the fantasy is shared by the extreme left and the extreme right, like some other fantasies. So there's nothing I reject more. I think that although they have other intentions, many of these extreme settlers and extreme people on the right are the most dangerous post-Zionists. It's not only that it's not moral, it's not only that it's not democratic. In my mind, it goes against the grain, the fundamental belief, the core of Zionism. And this is why I'm so happy that the alliance now between Mr. Herzog and Mrs. Livni is called the Machaneh HaTzioni. Some even say that perhaps I have some contributed to this in an indirect way. I didn't advise them, but I kept writing in my articles. The new debate in Israel should be to go to these extreme settlers and say, you are the anti-Zionists. You are the anti-Zionists. Because you are the one who are endangering the Jewish democratic state. We put so much effort, blood, sweat, and tears, and dreams into establishing our hope. And the people who think that the hills of Samaria are more important than our sovereignty, they are the worst enemy. They are the worst enemy. So don't get me wrong on that one. I'm as adamant against that approach as anyone. And when I talk about the two-state state, what I mean is that if we cannot, had I been Israel's prime minister, the first thing I would do is to take the Olmert plan or the Barak plan or the cleaner parameters, give them to my friend Yossi Beilin, send him to Ramallah and say, Yossi, please bring this back signed. Okay? I give you 6 months. But I will not waste a moment waiting for that to happen. Because if we cannot have it signed, and we tried it so many times, if something changes and the wording is found, great, I'm all for it. But if not so, we cannot be kept hostages to this great hope. So if we cannot solve Jerusalem and the right of return right now, let's do things that change the reality on the ground and move us in the right direction, even if we cannot achieve the last destination right now. I believe that this kind of an approach, this is what I mean when I say two-state. We have to launch the two-state dynamics immediately. I mean, and this is the point. If the two-state solution cannot be achieved tomorrow, we must at the very least keep the two-state option, launch two-state dynamics, and as I said, achieve this two-state state where the Palestinians have as much of a state as possible, even without having the final status agreement signed. This is what I mean.
Okay. We'll take two questions on this side then. Woman behind you. Yeah.
Before I start my question, the why word, which is definitely a question for me. I just wanted to suggest something. Instead of two-state federation, and then it will be more pragmatic, more clear what you mean.
But federation needs agreement and signing, which we've not done since when? Since the Hebron Agreement? Or the Y variant? No, the Y variant. Since 1990, with all the talk, think of how much we hear about it. Since 1998. By the way, the two last gentlemen who did it were Benjamin Netanyahu and Yasser Arafat, believe it or not, under President Clinton. But for 16 years, we've signed nothing. So how long will we wait for the next signature? Again, I want the signature. But if the signature is not there, let's act. We cannot just wait for this Godot forever. Go ahead.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, that if the Palestinians are not willing to do their part, then we need to take.
It's not only the Palestinians, it's us as well. I mean, I'm not putting all the blame on them. I think they have a lot of the blame, but it's,
Okay, now to my question.
Okay.
Why, after 60 years, I think, no, why, after 60 years, wouldn't be a historical justice to mention the same tragedy that happened to the Palestinians in 48, the tragedy that happened to almost 1 million Jews in the Arab countries that used to live there? They were not Zionists. The narrative that you're presenting here is not theirs. Most of them were not part of this Zionist movement. And they suffered because of the war in 48. Israel took responsibility, took them in, as you mentioned, in the 1950s, whereas in the Palestinians, in any Arab country around us, they didn't receive citizenship. They were not accepted. They're still, the flag that they want their land back because of that, this. So maybe it's time to just remember those Arab Jews that suffered the same kind of.
So as I totally agree, except for the why. I mean, I don't understand the question. I mean, it's.
Why didn't you mention this?
First of all, I mentioned, if you didn't hear, when I talked about Israel in the 50s, I said that all these refugees from the Arab world who lost everything overnight. But I totally agree. I mean, I think that when you talk about, first of all, there is Arab responsibility, and again, I said it earlier today in one of my discussions with the students, that the tendency, sometimes liberals in Israel, in America, and Europe have a difficulty in expressing sincere criticism of the Arab world or third world countries. And I think it's time to change. I think you cannot hold, and there should be criticism of Arab nations, just as there is criticism of Israel. And there should be criticism of Palestinians as well, when they do the wrong things. And liberals should get over the inhibition on this issue. I don't understand why is it there that difficulty. So I totally agree with you. The Arab record on this in both ways is shameful. One is the fact that there was no life for the Jewish communities actually in most countries. Again, there are some other examples in Morocco and Tunisia a bit, but actually in Iraq, in Egypt, in many other countries. So there was no real tolerance and there was no real acceptance to have the Jew. By the way, not only the Jewish minority, the richness the enchanting Levant existed under the colonialism, with the Greeks and the Armenians and the Jews and the Christians in Alexandria and Beirut and all that. And once Arab nationalism took over, there was very little room, not totally, but there was very little room to those minorities, and definitely to the Jewish minority. So that's one side. And the other side is really with the Palestinian issue. So again, one has to make the distinction, because Jordan, for instance, gave the Palestinians rights and actually absorbed them, and the Jordanians should get all the credit for that. But so many other Arab countries did not. You know, the Egyptians with Gaza, the Syrians, Lebanon, all that. So you're totally right. But that does not mean that the Palestinian tragedy did not happen. The Palestinian tragedy did happen, and the ramifications of that are still with us.
And as important as it was to bring Mr. Shavit here, we also have to get him out of here. So we have one more question. I think he's leaving. Okay. Anybody have a burning question?
Yeah, over there.
Okay. Come on
But
down to the
come
mic.
here.
And make it a short question, please.
I agree with you. I think it's kind of like a little bit easier than not to vilify like the Dati-Yomi and the sort of settlers who think what you were describing earlier as sort of some of the main people that we can blame for the ongoing nature of the settlements. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the aspects of them that are very much state-funded and propped up by the state, and their role in kind of both the fact that the settlements aren't going anywhere anytime soon, that they're actually expanding, and also their role in ongoing Nakba.
So you're asking about that it's not only the settler's responsibility, but it's state responsibility.
Yeah,
State
Okay.
funding of settlements.
Yeah,
the state a little bit more accountable for that, because you also emphasize, it's important not to be reactionary. It's important for Israel to be this progressive force, but there might be a danger in like romanticizing early Zionism so much while like sort of this stuff is still going on.
So, first of all, again, if you read my book and if you listen to some of the other things I say, I don't think I'm romanticizing in the sense that I was talking now about the great achievement of the 50s, but if, for instance, you'll read my chapter about the 50s, not only my other chapters, you will see that I describe the terrible price we paid for it as well. So it was, on the one hand, it was such a triumph, but there was such a terrible human price for it. Because the price was that we could not recognize real minority rights or individual rights. We were not only blind to see the Palestinians, we were blind to see the ultra-Orthodox, we were blind to see the very Holocaust survivors I was talking about. We did not let them really experience their grief. But again, if you look at it in context, you see that that was like needed at the time. Because there was no other way to achieve this great historical achievement. So, people because I'm not into making moral judgments here, I'm saying look at the beauty and achievement, but look all the time at the price, at the terrible price of it. It was there. And in many ways, I think that we are paying the price for that to this day. And this has to do with what you ask about the settlers and the state. Because basically what happened, the settlers were and still are a small minority. But they were very sophisticated, these people who are totally ignorant regarding the world we live in, the 21st century. They were very sophisticated in manipulating the Israeli political system. And basically what happened that in the early years, we had too much of a state, too much politics, too much of a hierarchical structure. In recent years, recent decades, Israel body politics is too weak. So small determined groups like the settlers can easily hijack it. And this is what they did. The fact that they controlled Likud and have the Beit Yehudi is like amazing overrepresentation. They use the fact that they are organized, they're determined, while the more reasonable, regular, so to speak, I'm not talking about benign Israelis, are not organized politically, and therefore they keep losing the battle. So in my mind, first of all, of course, there is state responsibility, but it was because the state became so weak. It began even with Yitzhak Rabin, the late Yitzhak Rabin, and Shimon Peres, who surrendered to the settlers with Ofra and Alon Moreh and other places, and then it went on with governments throughout the years. But the key here, in my mind, and I think this is a good point to end with, the key in my mind to the future of Israel is to understand what the overall picture. The overall picture is that we had a young, impressive, aggressive republic. It was amazing in what it achieved. It combined, as I said, realism with morality, but it was very, very tough. Then we were sick and tired of it, so we rebelled. We rebelled as minorities, the Arabs, ultra-Orthodox, the settlers, the peaceniks, the liberals, the hedonists. We rebelled as individuals. We said we are not willing to live with this constant mission all the time. We just want to have a life. And these rebellions had to happen because all the minorities needed to have their rights and their place, and the individuals had to have a life. You cannot live for 100 years all the time in khaki clothes with a rifle next to your bed. You cannot live like that. The problem was that we never established the second Israel Republic. And the second Israel Republic that has been missing for 30, 40 years has to focus on exactly that point. We have to find some sort of ethos that combines, that lets the different tribes of Israel live together, respecting all minorities, respecting the fact that many of us are so different from one another, and yet seeing what unifies us. And I think that if we'll find this new ethos that will hold us together, but not in a repressive way, not in an authoritarian way, but in a real democratic way, when Israel is really a federation of its tribes who respect one another, but yet see the core that is holding us together, and bring back a political system and a government that is functional, that can deal with these enormous challenges facing us, I think that if we do that, we can guarantee our future and we can bring back hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for the Center for Jewish Life for hosting this.